I'm going to talk to you today about my favorite topic, documentation. I've been writing developer documentation myself for about 25 years, so I've seen a lot over the years, and I hope to share some of my experiences with you. So first of all, why do we care about documentation? Why is it important? For open source software, there's sort of two sides to the coin. For people who are using or consuming modules, it allows them to code more efficiently when they can read the documentation and know what it does, how it works, use the features to their fullest. And for people who own or produce modules, it promotes adoption of the modules and encourages people to use them, and it reduces the burden of answering the same questions over and over. And especially for Node, because as we know, one of the great strengths of Node is its module ecosystem. And because of this sort of peer-to-peer development where at any given time a developer can be both a consumer and a producer of a module, documentation is particularly important. And so given these two sides of the coin, it's sort of important to know your audience at any given time, who you're writing for. Are you writing for contributors to a module, people who are actually going to be working on the module, or people who are just going to be using it or consuming it? And the number one rule in any kind of communication is knowing your audience. So it's important to keep in mind. So for example, contributors are usually obviously interested in the internals of a module. Users are not. They just want to know how to use it. Contributors need to understand how to run tests, have guidelines for contributing and so forth, and style guides. So those are two very different things. Today I'm mostly going to focus on the second group, the users or consumers of modules. So if documentation is important, as we've seen, why is it often so bad? Well, there's a number of reasons. One of them is functionality comes first. So if something doesn't work or it's just buggy, then all the documentation in the world is not going to help. This is also known as finite resources or triage. There's only so much time and developer effort to go around, and oftentimes it gets devoted just to developing software, not documenting it. And that sort of folds into this general culture of not recognizing the importance of documentation, which I hope to address. And even if you have created good documentation to begin with, over time it can deteriorate in what I call doc rot. You may have heard of code rot, where code is not maintained over time and it sort of becomes more buggy. The same thing happens with documentation. So bugs get fixed, things get changed, but the documentation is not changed accordingly. And so that's very common. Finally, creating and maintaining good documentation is just hard. Why? Why is it so hard? Well, there's a few reasons for that. For one, it requires sort of two different types of skills, right brain and left brain skills, writing and coding, or at least the ability to understand, to read code. Those are sort of two groups that may intersect, and there's oftentimes not a lot of intersection between the two. It just requires discipline. It's fun to write, create new features and write cool code. Not always as much fun to document it. So it does require a little bit of discipline. And you have to walk a mile in your user's shoes. And this is something that is very common. People know the stuff they're writing from the inside out. They know it very well, but they don't know it from the outside in, which is the perspective that you have to have when you document something. And finally, what I call developer machismo. And what I mean by that is sort of, as Wally is saying over here, the code is the documentation. This idea that you should just be able to read the code and understand it. And believe it or not, I've actually had developers say this to me. And while it's true, yes, you can go and read the code and you can eventually figure out how things work. Obviously, it's not very efficient. And for larger modules, it's just really impractical. So addressing this cultural aspect of it requires you to just acknowledge the value of doc and to really just think about it when you're developing the software up front and not just add it as an afterthought, and have a process that supports that. So as a simple example, at StrongLoop we have these issue labels in GitHub. We have one called doc, which just means it's something, write the documentation for this, or document XYZ. And then there's another one called NeedsDoc. So it'll be a feature or a bug fix or something that has an impact on documentation or requires some documentation. We give that a label NeedsDoc. So those two labels help us to sort of manage the work of maintaining and creating the documentation as we go. And the third thing is have an appropriate doc framework. And I'm going to dive a little bit more into that in a minute. So the developer culture, just to continue a little bit more on that, it's important to have docs and tests for PRs. I mean, that's, if you sort of require that for every PR, if you look at it and go, hey, does this have an impact on documentation? If so, then you need to write the documentation as part of the PR. And tests as well. That's just good software development procedure. Finally, just encouraging SMEs, which is subject matter experts, to contribute to docs. So someone who knows the subject, say, hey, write some doc for this. And then the third is have a doc curator, which is somebody like myself who may not necessarily be a subject matter expert. I may not know the code inside and out, but I understand how to organize stuff well. I can edit the stuff that's written by the subject matter experts and present it in an easy to digest way. So what is good documentation? Now, these are sort of four, what I call motherhoods, like motherhood and apple pie. They're things that sort of everybody realizes are good things. It needs to be accurate, it needs to be complete and concise, easy to use for everyone, well organized and up to date. And that's easier said than done. So I'm going to try and go through these fairly quickly here. How do you make it accurate, complete, and concise? Well, you make it easy to contribute. So here's an example in the LoopBack documentation here. I don't know if you can see this. I can make it a little bit bigger. We've got on every single page here, we've got this button that you can click, and it says edit it, and it takes you out to the GitHub page that's actually the markdown source for that page. And so if you want to contribute to the doc, you can just quite easily fork it and contribute in that way. And then we provide reusable authoring elements. So here's an example in LoopBack how we do this. We have these alerts. So it's very easy using these Jekyll alerts to sort of call out information. That just makes it easy to format the information in a way that is easily digestible. Easy to use for everybody. It's got good layout, responsive design, and also globalization. So the idea of being able to translate it into different languages, because not everybody speaks English. The Express docs provide an example of that. We've got, here's the Express doc site. It's, it's responsive. This is just something we've coded. And you can see I've got a promo for our talks on there. But you can see it, if you're looking at it on a phone, this is, it lays out accordingly. And even though, we expect developers to be obviously working on laptops or desktops, they may have a tablet or something there, or looking stuff up on the phone at the same time. So it's important for the documentation to be well organized. So have good navigation, a good usable search feature is critical, and if I have time, I'll give you a demonstration of that. Keeping it up to date, again, it's making it easy to contribute and the process. So quickly, the four basic types of documentation that you need to think about are reference, tasks, concepts, and tutorials. Now, I like to talk about documentation is like creating documentation is like building a house. So the API reference is really the foundation of the house, but API reference documentation is no more complete documentation than a concrete slab is a house that you can live in. It's important to have, but it's not the end of it. There's two ways you can generate API reference documentation with tools like JSdoc, or you can write them manually. Either way, there's pros and cons to both approaches. The second type is task documentation. It's sort of like the framing of the house. And this is also sometimes referred to as how-tos or recipes. This is sort of really the key use cases that describe how do you do what you need to do with this module. The third is the concept documentation. So not all projects will have this, but it's basically just explaining key concepts you need to understand to use the module. And the fourth is the tutorials. So these are like the finishes. This is the stuff like, that makes it really nice and easy for people to use and easy to get started. Typically, you'll have a getting started as the first tutorial you write, and you may go beyond that and have further tutorials. Now, typically, you write these in the opposite order in which they're read. So you'll start with the API reference stuff, get that more or less fleshed out, and then you go to your tasks and concepts, and finally the tutorials are written last. But the user coming in will, once he or she goes through the installation, will go through getting started, which is the tutorial, and then they'll sort of look at the tasks and say, okay, this is what I'm trying to accomplish, and they'll go from there and then go off to the API reference. So here's an example of the LoopBack documentation, which is automatically generated with a tool called StrongDocs. It's based on JSdoc. It's just an example. It's for large APIs, it's really preferable to have it to use automatically generated API docs, just because it's easier to maintain the accuracy over time because the code comments are right there next to the functions. The Express documentation, on the other hand, has manually written API docs. It's just mostly for historical reasons. Someday we may switch over to automatically generated, but currently they're all manually written. And it works fairly well. Express is a relatively small API, so it works reasonably well for that. Here's an example in the Express documentation of our sort of task. We have a menu called Guide, and it's got sort of all these different tasks that you might want to do, writing middleware, using middleware, error handling, and so forth. And in LoopBack, here's an example of our concepts. We have a whole page called Core Concepts, which really dives into the important things you need to understand for LoopBack. And we have a couple of tutorials. We have Getting Started, which has got like 7 chapters, and Getting Started Part 2, which has 6 or 7 chapters. And those are just basic examples of tutorials. Now, in general, for documentation, I'm a strong believer in examples. Examples are absolutely critical. People learn best from examples. It's sort of common understanding in cognitive science. So the more examples you can provide, the better. You can use them in your snippets in your reference API reference doc. You can use examples in your tasks and the tutorials. For example, the LoopBack, we have over 20 example repos for different sort of use cases, and that are documented fairly thoroughly. Okay, now I mentioned before having the appropriate docs framework is important. So there's sort of 3 choices in the GitHub universe for the frameworks, what I call a framework. It's basically a way to present documentation. First and foremost is the README. Every repo needs a README, and it's necessary but not sufficient in general. So beyond that, there is the GitHub wiki and Jekyll and GitHub Pages. So the README is sort of table stakes. Every module has to have a decent README. If you don't have a good README that at least describes what the module does, how to install it, how to use it, if people land on your module and they don't see a decent README, they're likely to just move on and go, I can't figure this out. I'm not going to waste my time. There's plenty of other modules out there. So it's really important to have a README. I'm not going to go too much into this because my time is very limited, but we do have some detailed guidelines in the LoopBack documentation about what constitutes a good README. I think most people have a pretty good understanding of that. It just mostly has to get someone up and going, give them a basic example of how to use it, how to install it, and so forth. Beyond that, the GitHub wiki, every module or every repo in GitHub comes with a wiki. If you just have to sort of click a checkbox to enable it. It's super easy to get going. It doesn't provide a lot of flexibility in terms of how you present it. And it can also sometimes be a little bit hard to discover. But it's a good sort of intermediate step between having a basic README and having something more involved like Jekyll. And using a GitHub wiki can be fine just for a medium-sized project. You can create perfectly good documentation in a GitHub wiki. And I've used it primarily myself for internal projects that are not exposed outside of, or not intended to be exposed outside of a company. And you can also use a GitHub wiki just for contributors. So you can have, say, hey, if you want to contribute to this module, go to the wiki. If you're a user of the module, look at the README or look at our Jekyll site. So here's an example of a good GitHub wiki. It's the Hystrix module. It's a Netflix module. It's very well put together, and it's a good example if you want to see one of those. So the sort of most capable option is Jekyll, which is built into GitHub in the sense that all you have to do is enable GitHub Pages, and it's just there for you. And so it's super convenient. It gives you completely customizable layout and navigation and branding. Both LoopBack.io and ExpressJS.com are done with Jekyll. You can basically make it look any way you want to. You can publish the site automatically using GitHub Pages to github.io, or if you have a custom domain, you can publish to that. The cons are it does require a little bit more work, and it's hard to combine documentation from multiple repos, which I'll address if I don't run out of time. So the great thing about Jekyll is it's fully integrated with GitHub. It allows you to have the same workflow as you do for code. You can have documentation issues and PRs to improve the documentation, and you can author directly in Markdown with the addition of liquid templating tags. And so, as I mentioned, ExpressJS.com is done with Jekyll, and if I have more time, and so is LoopBack.io. And you can see they look very different, but even though they use the same backend framework. So for a multi-module framework, and both Express and LoopBack sort of fall into this category, Jekyll makes the most sense because it really gives you so much flexibility. And in addition to simply providing the documentation in the repo, we've developed a method to sort of reuse READMEs for individual repos. So for example, LoopBack has a couple of dozen connectors, data source connectors. So we've got like a MongoDB connector, a MySQL connector. Each of those connectors has an individual README, which it sort of lives in its own world, and it's also included into the documentation of LoopBack as well. So that's what we call single sourcing in the TechPubs world. So this is just sort of an illustration of what I'm talking about here, where you've got the README living in GitHub, and it's obviously for modules that are published to NPM, that page also appears as the landing page on NPM, and in addition on the Jekyll-based site. So in summary, in order to make good documentation, you really have to have a cultural change, which requires recognizing the value of docs right up front, thinking about docs as you're developing, and establishing appropriate processes and framework to create the documentation as you go. And then picking the right tool. Is it just a README? Is it the GitHub wiki? Or is it a Jekyll site beyond that? So that is all I have today. Thank you. And I guess I've got time for a couple of questions, if anybody has any.
Okay. If anybody has any questions, just raise your hand and feel free to pick somebody out of the crowd.
Somebody over there. Okay.
I'm sorry, who'd you pick?
Could you talk about multiple repos, and have you faced a scenario where you have private repo and public repo and you need to manage documentation across them, I guess, in your experience?
Yeah. We haven't done that as far as having private repos, but you could do it. I guess right now the technique that we use to get the READMEs into, for example, in both LoopBack and Express, is basically we have a shell script that uses that just curls out to the GitHub static domain and pulls the README down. You could probably, if you program in some auth, you could do it with a private repo. We haven't done that yet, but you certainly could.
Time for another question?
Any other questions? Okay. Does anybody want to see a demo of the LoopBack or Express docs? I don't know. I can show you that. This is the LoopBack doc site. We just launched this site a couple of weeks ago, and it used to be in a proprietary wiki, and we went through a fairly lengthy process of migrating it over. But here's an example of navigation. Let's see. You can see we have this sort of expandable navigation on the side here, and here's the tutorials. So I can show you example of wikis. Or, sorry, can't see. There we go. So yeah, for components here. So these are examples of READMEs that are pulled in. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I guess I'm out of time now, but I encourage you to go take a look at loopback.io and expressjs.com. They're both open source. You can see how they're done. Email me or ping me on Twitter. Thanks.